Hi everybody, this is Meredith from the Witty Gritty Paper Co. and today is Watercolor Portraits for Beginners Part 2. Last week we talked all about preparing a good sketch as a foundation for your watercolor portrait, and today we're going to be talking about mixing skin tones. So let's dive right in with that. I hear all the time from people that this is the most intimidating part for them, is mixing realistic skin tones. But I'm going to try my best to make it easy for us here. Let me zoom in just a little. Okay, so the first thing that you should probably know is that in my experience, there are about 3 major categories of skin tone. So there's white skin, which is usually belongs to people of European descent. There's black skin, which is usually associated with African Americans, or also the Aborigines from Australia actually would fall into this category. And then there's our third category here, which is sort of tan olivey skin. And this is the broadest of the 3 categories. It has the most races and nationalities that fall into this. I've written down just a couple here. So Native American, Hispanic, Indian, Italian, Mediterranean, that sort of thing. There's a lot of variation in this third category, but there are 3 major categories. So when you're mixing skin tones and, trying to decide where to start, you want to first figure out which category your subject falls into. So beyond picking a category, you're also going to actually have to mix multiple shades of a skin tone. So if your subject falls into our third category here, you can't just mix this color and paint their whole face and have them look realistic. And the reason for this is people's skin is never just one color. Because of light and shadows, skin can appear to be a whole host of different shades of colors, even within categories. Sometimes the lighting can be so dramatic in reference photos that the skin will actually, the shades you need to make the skin look realistic can actually be in multiple categories. But usually it's just 4 or 5 shades per portrait within a category, usually. Now, don't freak out. Don't freak out. Don't get scared. All of these colors, there are 15 different shades that I made for each of the categories, and I just made these pretty quick, like off the top of my head, so I'm sure that there are more. These are not like all the skin tones that exist. I'm sure that there are other variations too that aren't on here, but all of these here, all of these little tablets were made from these 3 bases. So I'll be sharing with you my personal recipes for making the 3 categories, but everything else on here was just started like these, and I added more of a certain color, like I would add more yellow, or I'd add more red or blue to make all the other shades. So you may look at some of these shades, speaking of that, and think to yourself, people aren't that color, like some of them are kind of yellow here, they almost look jaundice, and some of these look quite skin burned or sunburned. But like I said, people are not just one color. So you would be, I think, quite surprised to see sometimes when you're analyzing a reference photo just how dramatic the differences can be between different areas of skin on a person's face. Like if there's really intense sunlight, the highlights on their face, on their skin, can be almost white. Where even if they have darker, like red skin, the highlight on their nose can be almost white. So you won't just find one color, mix it, and be done. Skin tones require at least 4 to 5 to make it look 3-dimensional. But once again, don't be afraid. You don't have to mix all 3 to 5 at once. In a later video, we'll get into sort of the exact processes of painting a face, so you don't have to be overwhelmed. You don't have to worry. We will get into that. We'll go step by step. We'll make it nice and easy. But it's important to know that skin tones, you're going to need multiple different shades to make your face look realistic. So how do you figure out what these shades are, right? So let's do a little exercise here. Let me move these just off to the side. So here I have a photo of a smiling Indian woman, And the light in this photo is pretty dramatic. As you can see, it's probably coming from like here, so it's not hitting her directly. The highlight on the bridge of her nose tells me that it's coming from like here, and that it's pretty harsh light. And with harsh light, keep this in mind when you're picking reference photos, with harsh light, there's always going to be more variation in the color of the person's skin. That's important to remember. So harsh lit photos are usually more complicated to paint. You shouldn't let it scare you away, but it might not be the best thing to start with. So let's do our exercise here. Zoom in. What I have here on the right is a little tool called a viewfinder. So I made this one myself. I think you can buy them, but you should just make it yourself. It's literally just a piece of cardstock with 3 different size rectangles that I cut out of it with an X-Acto knife. And the purpose of it is so that you can isolate the different colors in a reference photo. So if I was looking at her face and I just felt super intimidated, I don't know what color I should start with, I don't even know how many there are, what I could do is I could take the smallest rectangle on my viewfinder and just move it around to different areas of her face to isolate the colors. So I'm going to zoom in even more here because this is a really tiny little viewfinder. So say you start on her forehead here. So this is like a pretty light tone, pretty chill, but then just move down just a little bit and it gets much darker. So this is not all one color, and viewfinders make it really easy to identify. And these shadows here on the right-hand side of her face, those are really dark. So anyway, this is just a little tool to break down mixing skin tones if you're feeling a little overwhelmed. And actually you can use viewfinders for all different types of paintings to make it easier. So that's just a little exercise that you can do if you're feeling overwhelmed and trying to figure out actually how many different shades of color are in a person's face. I could probably count out 4, 5, maybe even 6 in her face with my little viewfinder. Okay, so the last thing that I want to leave you with here for skin tones is my personal recipes for making these 3 main categories of skin tones. So like I said, everything that I painted here in these little tablets, all of these came from these bases. So I have specific recipes for these 3 category bases. That's what I'm going to show you. But I want you to know the way that I make them, I use pretty specific shades of colors in pretty specific brands, but you do not have to have the exact colors that I have to make these colors. You should still try to make them with whatever you have that's closest. So don't feel like you have to run out and buy new paint or that you shouldn't even try because you don't have the specific colors I'm going to use. The ones that I'm using them because they're the ones that have worked most foolproof for me, but you really don't need to have these specifically. Just use whatever you have that's close. Don't get intimidated, and you'll be fine. Skin tones requires a decent amount of experimentation before you have something foolproof, and you might come up with some recipes of your own too. So don't worry about it. Don't get intimidated. So let's start with our first category, the Caucasian skin. And my recipe for that is actually pretty simple. Let me have my little... Let's see. I feel like I may have zoomed in too much. I want to make sure you can see the mixing itself. Okay. So my recipe for the Caucasian skin, and feel free to pause the video and write this down, is 1 part water. So this is just plain water on my brush. So fill in one of these little rectangles. We can remember what we did. 1 part just plain water. And this is important for getting it light enough. To 2 parts Naples yellow. And the Naples yellow that I use is made by Daniel Smith. And that's just the one that I like the best. I would say that yellow ochre is probably the closest you're going to get if you don't have Naples yellow and you need something a bit more standard in a watercolor palette. But whatever you have that's closest. So 1 part water to 2 parts Naples yellow, and then 1 part cadmium red deep made by Core. Now I will tell you from personal experience that you got to be really careful with this color. This is a really strong color. I try to add it in as little little bits as possible, because as soon as you add too much, it's kind of hard to save the color. So add it really slowly. It's a really strong one. And the one that I use is made by Core. I think I mentioned that, but if I didn't, the one that I use is made by Core, which may make it particularly strong. But basically you need a cool red. So if you don't have cadmium red deep, don't worry about it. Alizarin crimson would probably work pretty well. Any cool red. So here's our just standard recipe for Caucasian skin. I forgot to fill in the boxes. I'll do that quick. Just a little side note. Some brands of paint sell colors that are actually called flesh tones, or I've seen them called flesh tint. I would caution you against buying these. Personally, I think that they look kind of artificial. Unless you're planning to add to them, I wouldn't really recommend that you just use them straight like that, because they look they look almost rashy, like they're too red for my personal taste. So if you see those and think, oh, that's a super easy way to do it, I wouldn't really recommend that unless you're going to doctor them up a little bit with other colors. So we have 1 part water, 2 parts Naples yellow, 1 part cadmium red deep to have our basic Caucasian flesh tone. Okay, so let's move this down, move this over a little bit, and we'll do our African American tone. Okay, so the recipe for this one is a little bit, has an extra color, and it is a little bit more involved and actually a little surprising, but it is my favorite way to mix it. So let me get the correct colors here. Okay. I have a lot of paint out. All right, I think I got it. I think I got the right one here. Okay, so for our middle category, what you want to use is 2 parts sepia. I use the Daniel Smith sepia. It's my favorite, but once again, any sepia that you have. Raw umber would probably be closest. A sepia is like a really dark, cool brown. So whatever you have that's closest to that. But I would tell you that if you are able to purchase another color, sepia is an amazing color to have. In general, I use it all the time for all different subject matter. So I think you'll definitely find use out of it if you do decide to get it. So 2 parts sepia to 2 parts burnt umber. So not raw umber, burnt umber. Burnt umber and raw umber are different because burnt umber is a lot warmer in color and raw umber is a lot cooler. So I've got my burnt umber, and the burnt umber that I am using is made by Winsor & Newton. But once again, whichever one you have. Okay. The last part for this recipe is 1 part dioxazine violet. So this is a super dark purple. I use the Winsor & Newton brand of it, but whatever you have, that's a super dark color. You don't want to use anything that's sort of lavendery. Now, this is the only skin tone that I found basically every time I make it, I need to adjust it a little bit. So like this is clearly too purple. So I'm going to add some more sepia. But the bottom line is you want more brown than purple. The purple is sort of an interesting addition and really makes it look more realistic, but it can overpower it, particularly dioxazine violet is a very powerful violet. It can sort of overwhelm the other colors. So don't be afraid to adjust it until it looks correct to you. See, that still looks too purple to me. So see, even with a recipe, there's a certain amount of trial and error with skin tones. All right. I'm almost out of sepia in my palette. I would probably add a little bit more sepia if I had it, but we're going to go with this for now. And once again, I forgot to fill in the squares. Let me do that quick. I think it's helpful to be able to see the ingredients, not just the finished product. So here we have sepia. We have burnt umber, which, like I said, you can see it's a very warm, almost orangey brown. And then our dioxazine violet, which is a very powerful color. Look how dark that is. Yeah, definitely want to not have a heavy hand when using that. But that's our recipe for our second category. And for our third category, our tan olivey skin. Let's see if I can maybe turn it this way so we can still see what's happening. Okay, so the recipe for our third category is pretty simple. The first thing you want to do is start out with the recipe for the Caucasian skin. So this, I've still got some of it mixed up. So you want to start with that as your base. And then to that, you just want to add, actually, let me paint that in. Let's see if I remember. I remembered this time. Okay, so start with your Caucasian mix. And you want to add, this is important, you want to add just a smidge of burnt umber. And then, I know, very technical term, smidge. And then about the same amount of Nicolazo yellow. Now the Nicolazo yellow that I use is the Core brand. Basically all of the Core paint is really intense. So you want to be careful that you don't add too much. It can overpower it really easily. But basically a vibrant yellow is what you want if you don't have Nicolazo. Okay, and once again I have to fill in the boxes because I keep forgetting. I actually have an extra box drawn in here for this one, and that's because, like I said, this is probably the broadest category of the three. So you may have to add another color, like a red or sepia, or something else to get the temperature of the particular shade that you need for your subject, because this really is a very broad category. So I'm not going to add a fourth color, but you may want to add an extra color to influence this base recipe, since this is such a broad category with so many nationalities and races in it. Okay, so let's take a look here. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this. This is a little yellow, but other than that, I'm pretty happy with how these came out. These are just the recipes that I've developed with the colors that I've had available to me. So feel free to venture out on your own and try it a little bit. And I definitely recommend that you make these three recipes, try out all of them, and then also try to do something like this. Try to make as many other shades from these shades as possible before you get into painting full portraits. So that's our lesson for this week. Next time we'll be talking about layering and hair and such. So stay tuned for that. And if you like this video, please hit the like button and hit the subscribe button for more content like it. And thank you so much for watching as always. I hope you have a lovely day. Bye.